Chris Halliwell lived a life of quiet routine. DS Lena Radmore followed patterns others missed. And Imelda Crane simply stepped into a taxi. None of them knew that only one of them would come out of the story alive. This case wasn't about sloppy mistakes or careless violence. It was about a killer who used misdirection like a magician, burying not just bodies, but truth, and the sickening trick he pulled nearly let him vanish forever. Imelda Crane had spent the afternoon rehearsing for her upcoming recital, a performance that meant everything to her. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, she left the academy with her violin case in hand and texted a friend that she was grabbing a cab home. That would be the last anyone heard from her. When she failed to show up at her apartment or answer her phone, her family grew worried. The next morning, her mother filed a missing persons report. At first, authorities assumed it was just another young adult, off the grid for a while. But something about Imelda's disappearance felt different. She wasn't the type to vanish without a word. The case reached DS Lena Radmore after 5 days of no leads. Known for her instinctive reading of crime scenes and suspects, Lena was immediately struck by the absence of digital traces. Imelda's phone had been active up until 6:52 p.m. that evening, when it had suddenly gone offline in a rural area near Swanton Forest, miles away from her usual route home. There were no security cameras in that stretch of road, and no witnesses had reported anything unusual. Radmore started by tracking down every cab operating in the area at the time. Most drivers were ruled out quickly. Clear logs, dashcam footage, alibis that checked out. Then came Chris Halliwell. A quiet, well-mannered man in his early 40s, he'd worked as a taxi driver for over a decade. His records showed he was active that evening, but there was a suspicious 22-minute gap between fares. He claimed he had stopped for food and didn't pick anyone up during that time. There was no receipt, no dashcam footage, and no passenger log for that gap. Chris Halliwell was flagged as a person of interest, but there wasn't enough to hold him. Lena kept him under passive observation while digging deeper into past disappearances. That's when she found the chilling pattern. Another woman, Kira Menley, had vanished 6 months prior after calling a taxi in a neighboring town. Her case had gone cold. A year before that, 19-year-old Marla Fenn had disappeared under nearly identical circumstances. She too was last seen getting into a cab alone. Each woman had different physical traits, one blonde, one redhead, one brunette. They came from different towns and lived separate lives. But all three had vanished near wooded or remote areas after hailing a ride. The only consistent factor was the method of disappearance. No witnesses, no struggle, and no trace after entering a vehicle. Lena started mapping the disappearances on a digital grid. The connection was subtle, but undeniable. Each location formed a loose perimeter around Swanton Forest. While police intensified searches in the forest, Lena obtained a warrant to review GPS data from Chris Halliwell's car. What she found was disturbing. On the nights of all three disappearances, his vehicle had pinged off cell towers within proximity to the forest, each time within minutes of the victims' phones going offline. It was circumstantial, but it added weight to the suspicion. Lena's gut told her this wasn't a coincidence. Yet without bodies or physical evidence, it remained a theory. She met with the families of the missing women, hoping for any personal clues that might tie them together. All three had musical backgrounds. All three had a known preference for taking cabs instead of driving. And all three had vanished without any sign of a struggle. The more Lena uncovered, the more uneasy she became. It wasn't just the pattern, it was the silence, the emptiness left behind. Whoever was responsible wasn't sloppy. He knew how to erase traces, how to move without being seen. And it felt like he was watching the investigation unfold, staying one step ahead. When Lena received a call that a hiker had found human remains in the outskirts of Swanton Forest, everything changed. The discovery would finally turn suspicion into certainty. And the darkness surrounding the case would only deepen from there. The discovery of human remains near the edge of Swanton Forest sent a wave of urgency through the investigation. Mara Lewin, a seasoned survivalist known for documenting her hikes online, had been exploring a less traveled path when her dog began digging at a moss-covered mound. At first, she thought it was just an animal carcass, but the faint shape of a human skull beneath the soil forced her to call authorities immediately. Forensic teams arrived within hours, and what they found was deeply unsettling. The body had been buried shallowly, covered with branches and decaying leaves, almost as if the killer wanted it to be found, but not too soon. The skeleton was mostly intact, and a rust-colored scarf was still looped loosely around the neck. Near the hand, clutched tightly, was a strand of golden hair. It was this small detail that caused confusion. Imelda Crane was a brunette. Yet the DNA analysis confirmed that the remains were hers. As the team expanded the search area, they uncovered 2 more burial sites within a 1-mile radius. Both sites mirrored the first carefully arranged bones, symbolic placement of items, and a blonde hair strand placed in the deceased's hand. It wasn't just a dumping ground. It was something more ritualistic, possibly staged for a reason. Retired forensic analyst Jonas Plimpton, who had spent his career examining burial sites of serial killers, was brought in to consult. Plimpton noticed several striking details that set these graves apart. First, the killer hadn't buried the bodies to hide them permanently. The soil was loosely packed, the grave shallow, and the arrangement of bones seemed intentional. Each victim had been placed with their heads facing east and arms folded neatly, as if laid to rest in a ceremonial fashion. Then there was the blonde hair. Plimpton took one look at the strands and raised a red flag. They weren't natural. Lab testing confirmed they were synthetic, high-quality wig fibers designed to mimic real hair. This revelation shifted the narrative. The killer had gone out of his way to make it look like the victims were blonde, even though they were not. It wasn't just a disguise, it was deliberate misdirection. DS Lena Radmore realized this tactic had worked effectively. In the early stages of the investigation, police databases had filtered victims under blonde female disappearances, overlooking both Marla Fenn and Kira Menley due to their natural hair colors. The synthetic wigs had thrown off the profiling and, perhaps more sinisterly, wasted months of investigative focus on the wrong pattern. The media picked up the story quickly, dubbing the burial site the Bone Garden. It painted a macabre picture of a calculating murderer who manipulated crime scenes to his advantage. But the public didn't know the most disturbing part. Each victim had their personal belongings removed, save for one small item, a single earring, a charm, a ribbon. All of them were placed in the victim's hand, alongside the wig hair, as if to preserve a piece of identity while altering the rest. Lena and her team combed through Chris Halliwell's background again. His clean record, meticulous work ethic, and calm demeanor stood in sharp contrast to the twisted nature of the graves. Yet the location of the burial sites aligned almost perfectly with the signal history from his taxi GPS. The connection was tightening. But Lena knew she needed more. The investigative unit launched a full forensic sweep of Halliwell's home and vehicle. Dogs trained to detect decomposition were brought in, but his taxi had recently been cleaned with industrial solvents, scrubbing away most traces. However, a hairbrush found beneath the front passenger seat contained synthetic blonde strands identical to those found in the forest. Jonas Plimpton grew increasingly certain that the killer was enjoying the attention. The careful staging, the misleading evidence, the eerie consistency, it pointed to a mind that wanted to control the story, even in death. He warned Lena that the wigs and rituals weren't just about hiding identity. They were psychological games meant to test how long the truth could be kept buried. And yet, even with these discoveries, Chris Halliwell said nothing. He continued his life as though nothing had changed, unaware that the walls around him were slowly closing in. The forest had finally given up its secrets, but the real question now was why? Why go to such lengths? And how many more graves were still waiting to be found? The third burial site revealed something new: traces of a rare resin substance in the soil that matched an adhesive commonly used in theatrical makeup. This clue shifted the focus from simply tracking Chris Halliwell's movements to understanding his psychology. DS Lena Radmore, already convinced the wigs and staged graves were part of a larger misdirection strategy, now suspected the killer had experience in creating illusions. But what kind of person thinks to use synthetic hair and theatrical resin to disguise victims and falsify patterns? Lena's team re-examined the original missing persons reports, this time with the knowledge that all physical evidence could be planted or manipulated. Victim timelines were cross-checked and interviews with families resumed. A troubling trend began to emerge. All three women had used the same taxi service during their final known movements, and each had previously received anonymous texts offering free rides as part of a supposed loyalty program. Investigators traced the messages to a burner phone purchased at a corner shop in the outskirts of town less than a mile from Chris Halliwell's home. Even more alarming, surveillance footage from the shop showed a man matching Halliwell's height and build purchasing several burner phones over a 6-month period. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was growing clearer that Chris had been planning these abductions far more methodically than initially believed. He hadn't just stumbled into murder, he'd constructed an entire false reality around his crimes to mislead everyone, from the families to the police. A forensic sweep of his vehicle's upholstery revealed faint chemical burns, consistent with industrial bleaching agents. These agents had likely been used to destroy trace DNA. Hidden beneath the front seat was a cracked phone casing, wedged deep in the frame. It was registered to one of the victims, Kyra Menley, though it had been wiped clean. The casing alone was enough to justify a deeper investigation. It was then that forensic consultant Jonas Plimpton made a chilling observation. Each burial site, when plotted on a map, formed a distorted triangle, with the tip pointing to a patch of forest that had yet to be searched. The triangle's layout wasn't random, it appeared intentional, like a breadcrumb trail. Lena authorized an aerial scan and ground sweep of the location, focusing on any disturbances in the soil. Deep within the forest's thickest section, the team unearthed a fourth site. But this one was different. Unlike the other graves, this one was far deeper, reinforced with stones and tree roots, and wrapped in a black tarp. Inside, they found not one but two bodies, both in advanced stages of decomposition. One was a woman, fitting the profile of a missing case from nearly 3 years earlier. The other was male, mid-40s, with signs of head trauma. It was the first male victim, and that shattered the profiler's expectations. The male victim's identity came as a surprise. Oliver Branks, a former co-worker of Chris Halliwell, who had vanished suddenly and was thought to have moved abroad. His last known contact had been with Halliwell. Records showed that the two had worked together for 5 years before. Branks was terminated for a mysterious violation involving stolen passenger data. That piece of information changed everything. DS Radmore now believed that Branks had discovered something about Halliwell's early patterns and threatened to expose him, or perhaps tried to blackmail him. Either way, Halliwell had killed him and buried him alongside one of his earliest victims. This grave had not been made for the public or the police. It had been hidden deep and meant to stay that way, but the most horrifying discovery was yet to come. In a hidden compartment inside the fourth grave, investigators found a sealed plastic box containing several synthetic wigs, a notebook filled with coded entries, and a single chilling object, a rubber mask molded to resemble Halliwell's own face. It was as if he had planned for someone else to one day take the fall, or to stage his own disappearance entirely. Now, the case was no longer about just the murders. It was about how far Chris Halliwell was willing to go to escape justice and How many layers of deception still remained? As pressure mounted on the investigation, Chris Halliwell remained unnervingly composed. He still drove his taxi by day, smiled politely at customers, and kept to his quiet routines. But behind his mild demeanor, the evidence was building. DS Lena Radmore, now certain she was dealing with a highly intelligent and manipulative killer, focused her attention on Halliwell's surroundings. If the graves were only part of the performance, then there had to be more manipulation, more control, more layers to his deception. That was when Brady Vexley, Halliwell's neighbor, in the duplex apartment block, agreed to a formal interview. An eccentric man in his 60s with a fascination for electronics and radio signals, Brady had always considered Halliwell strangely quiet but polite. However, over the past year, he had noticed some odd behavior. Most nights, between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., strange sounds would drift up through the floor. Classical music, always the same melody, paired with muffled thuds and the occasional electric hum. Brady initially assumed Halliwell was watching films or using sound therapy devices. But in recent weeks, a foul chemical smell had begun seeping into his own apartment. It was sharp, acidic, and persistent. Thinking it was a plumbing issue, he once knocked on Halliwell's door, but there was no answer. He left it alone until the news of the bodies surfaced. That's when he contacted police. Using this new tip, DS Radmore obtained a second more invasive search warrant for Halliwell's property, including the garage beneath his unit. The team expected to find storage tools, perhaps more burial-related equipment. Instead, they found something far more sinister. Hidden behind soundproof insulation and a faux drywall panel was a narrow room no larger than a walk-in closet. It had been converted into a chilling personal workspace. The walls were lined with hooks holding various wigs, clothing, and accessories meticulously labeled with dates and victim initials. In one corner sat a violin, strings frayed and stained. It was quickly confirmed to belong to Imelda Crane. Her DNA was present on the bridge and fingerboard. There was also a camera mounted on a tripod facing the chair in the center of the room. Though the memory cards were missing, the presence of audio equipment suggested this room had been used to stage or record interactions with victims before their deaths. Investigators found dozens of labeled perfume bottles, cheap, floral scents, which matched the chemical compound used to mask the odor of decomposition in the graves. Halliwell had applied perfume not only to the wigs, but also to the items left with the victims. It served a dual purpose: psychological misdirection and olfactory concealment. The man wasn't just trying to get away with murder, he was trying to manipulate every sensory aspect of the crime scene. On a shelf above the wigs were several burner phones, some broken, some still functional. Forensic experts managed to recover partial data from 2 of them. What they found sent shivers through the task force. Dozens of messages written in casual language, pretending to be from friends or service providers, inviting the victims to events or offering ride discounts, each message calculated, each trap deliberate. Further analysis of the notebook discovered in the 4th grave provided insights into Halliwell's methodology. It wasn't simply a log of events. It was a psychological diary entries written in the 3rd person, detailing how the subject was watched, how she reacted to stimuli, what made her nervous, and when she was most vulnerable. This wasn't just stalking. It was behavioral conditioning. Halliwell had studied his victims like test subjects, observing routines, testing reactions, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect was a list on the final pages. It contained initials of women who had not yet been reported missing. 5 names, 5 sets of routines, 5 countdowns. DS Radmore's heart sank. It meant he wasn't done. He was preparing his next cycle. Each phase: observation, interaction, isolation, abduction had a checkmark beside it. The realization was crushing. While investigators were only beginning to uncover the truth, Halliwell had been rehearsing the next act. His entire life had become a carefully crafted performance, with death as its final scene. And unless they acted quickly, someone else would soon become the next character in his sick and scripted play. The discovery of the hidden room and the chilling list of future targets shifted the case into its final and most urgent phase. DS Lena Radmore assembled a task force to locate the women whose initials appeared in Chris Halliwell's notebook. Within 48 hours, 4 were confirmed to be safe, though each reported minor, eerie incidents from recent weeks' misplaced belongings, odd text messages, or seeing the same car parked outside their home multiple times. They hadn't connected the dots, but the danger had been real. The 5th woman, however, Nell Ashbury, had not shown up to her university classes for 3 days. Her phone was off, her apartment undisturbed, and her bike still chained outside. The campus library. Lena knew there wasn't a second to lose. The team launched an immediate search, focusing on Swanton Forest once again. But Halliwell's previous burial patterns suggested he wouldn't reuse the same locations now that they had been discovered. Plimpton returned to the case maps and examined Halliwell's recent movement data, focusing on a separate patch of woodland adjacent to a decommissioned railway line. A drone search revealed a faint trail leading to an abandoned hunting cabin, long forgotten by locals. It matched coordinates that had appeared multiple times in the burner phone's location history. Inside the cabin, investigators found a newly installed padlock, broken open within seconds. What they found inside was more disturbing than any of the graves. The room was soundproofed, with a mattress on the floor, a bucket, and chains bolted to the walls. A table nearby held several wigs, bottles of perfume, and a plastic container filled with surgical gloves. On a shelf sat an open laptop connected to a power bank, running a blank text document. The air was heavy with the same sweet artificial scent found on the victims. But most crucially, Nell Ashbury was found alive, frightened, dehydrated, but uninjured. Her hands were bound, and she had been sedated with over-the-counter sleeping medication. Halliwell had planned to kill her soon. They had made it just in time. Chris Halliwell was arrested at a roadside diner 2 towns away, behaving as though nothing had happened. Calm and collected, he made no attempt to flee or resist. Even during interrogation, he maintained a polite tone, denying every accusation. When presented with the evidence, the synthetic hair, the camera footage, the notebooks, he simply smiled. Forensic evidence tied him undeniably to the cabin, the burial sites, and the victims. But what puzzled investigators most was his refusal to speak about motive. Psychological evaluations labeled him as a high-functioning sociopath with narcissistic delusions. His killings weren't impulsive. They were rehearsed, refined, and ritualized. Experts believed the wigs, the perfume, and the burial patterns were part of a grand narrative in Halliwell's mind. He had created his own reality, where victims were roles in a twisted play, and he was both director and performer. The rubber mask found in the grave wasn't just a tool, it symbolized his belief that identity itself was a costume to be worn, discarded, or planted on others. But Halliwell hadn't accounted for Mara Lewin's dog, or Brady Vexley's nose, or the sheer persistence of DS Radmore. His calculated world had slowly crumbled under the weight of his own arrogance. The trial drew nationwide attention. Families of the victims filled the courtroom as prosecutors revealed the full extent of Halliwell's crimes. He showed no emotion, not even when graphic photos were presented or recordings played. He refused to speak in his defense and never once addressed the families. He was sentenced to life, imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In the end, what haunted investigators most wasn't just the horror of what he'd done, but the brilliance behind it. Halliwell hadn't just committed murder, he had waged psychological warfare. Every detail was a trap, every misdirection a carefully crafted lie. And had the timing been even a day too late, Nell Ashbury might have become another name on a gravestone carefully arranged beneath moss and leaves. The case became a chilling example of how intelligence and evil can intersect, and how sometimes catching a killer isn't about catching a man, but dismantling the world he so carefully built.